For more, we're joined here by France 24's Douglas Herbert, and also joining us from Hong Kong, Jason Eng of the Progressive Lawyers Group, the author of Umbrellas in Bloom. Thank you for speaking with us on France 24. First, though, we go
Hi,
to...
thank you for having me.
We go to correspondent Erin Hale. Erin, tell us where you are.
Hi, I'm just outside of Admiralty where protests are sort of simmering down for the night, although it looks like there's going to be a lot of back and forth between protesters and riot police with barricades for much of the evening.
What's been the mood the last couple of hours? Because we had the bill withdrawn hours ago, and yet people are still out in the streets.
Oh, yes, people are still very angry. They vowed to stay here until the bill is fully withdrawn. Actually, the anger got more intense as the day went on. And now I think they're sort of holding on for the night to see if they can still keep their ground. I think riot police are going to continue to try to take back a lot of that territory as people go home for the night. But there is definitely a committed group of hardcore protesters who want to stay for the whole evening.
What did those protesters tell you, Erin?
Many of them were very angry and very upset. They said it was up to young people to defend Hong Kong. A lot of the older protesters said they were here to support people fighting on the front line. They really feel like their city is under attack and that this is really the last stand with China.
Some of the reports qualify as unprecedented, the violence that we've seen this Wednesday. Is that a fair assessment?
There was a lot of violence at the end of the umbrella movement protests, but that happened, weeks in, and that was mostly in Kowloon, where a lot of the media actually wasn't stationed. I would say that the speed at which this became violent and, the incursions of the riot police, that is unprecedented. It's very different from Sunday's protest, which felt extremely peaceful. There were people out there with their kids, there were a lot of older people. It did get a little bit nasty after midnight, but that was well after the official protest had ended.
And just to recap, Erin, you're saying those protesters, the hardcore of them, trying to hold ground. What's their strategy going forward? Did they tell you?
They haven't told me, but I saw them in action. There was a lot of cat and mouse where, the riot police would come in, they'd take the barricades away, and then as soon as they left, the protesters would rush and retie up the barricades with plastic twist ties to make it harder. They've definitely, dug in. They have supplies, they have water, they have snacks, they have, masks, and I think their friends will be back tomorrow to bring them fresh reinforcements.
All right, many thanks for that live update. Erin Hale in Hong Kong, and let's stay in Hong Kong with Jason Eng. Jason, your thoughts on what we've seen, that cat and mouse game that between police and protesters going well into the night. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so even though the government has agreed to postpone the second reading of the extradition bill, people seem to continue to be angry. They continue to want to vent their rage. They want to remain on the streets. I guess they fear that if they leave, they might not have the same momentum the next day. And it is very important for them to keep the momentum, to keep the numbers, because they find strength in numbers. That's the only way they can counter the increasing police force being used on them.
And the calculus of the police is they don't want to see a repeat of the massive sit-in that we saw in the center of Hong Kong back in 2014.
Yeah, that is correct. I mean, the police has been relatively restrained, I think, partly because it was a Monday. Monday is a work day. And so it was very hard to tell protesters from sort of the regular Joe going to work. And, certainly the government or the police force really didn't want to get into a public relations disaster where they sort of were viewed as cracking down on regular normal civilians rather than protesters. And so they were treading relatively cautiously today, but it remains to be seen whether that show of restraint will continue.
Yeah, because with the time difference, Jason, here in France, when we woke up early this morning, we'd heard the bill had been scrapped. Then we found out, actually, no, that's not true. It had been simply postponed. What, in your eyes, what's the future of this extradition bill?
Yeah, so the bill was supposed to go through the second debate, the second reading today, and the third reading and the final reading where the legislature will basically pass the bill is originally scheduled to be next Thursday. So the protesters' aim is to derail that timetable, so much so that it's going to sort of miss the summer deadline and wait for the legislature to reconvene later on the year, hoping that that would then completely derail the bill or give the government a way to climb down and withdraw the bill altogether.
Stay with us, Jason, because we're going to look now at the political reaction. And we had a tearful interview with Carrie Lam earlier. She said, "How can I betray Hong Kong?" In exchange with broadcaster TVB, the territory's chief executive. You could say in sync with the message out of Beijing, though. Kathy Clifford has that story.
At the root of the clashes, a bill that would allow criminals to be extradited from Hong Kong to mainland China, a country which faces international criticism over its judicial independence and human rights records. It's raised public concern in the territory over greater Chinese control and erosion of civil liberties. Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam acknowledged the controversy, but disagreed with the methods the protesters are using.
If young people have already been out protesting and you're not giving them what they want, then what can you do? If I always give whatever my sons ask for, well, our relationship will be good in the short term. But if I let him do whatever he wants, when he grows up, he would regret it.
The legislation has also caused chaos in Parliament. Officials say it would close a loophole which they claim has allowed the city to become a haven for criminals from the mainland. Meanwhile, Chinese authorities were quick to condemn the violence.
Any action that undermines Hong Kong's prosperity and stability is opposed by Hong Kong's mainstream public opinion. The central government of China firmly supports the Hong Kong government in promoting the revision of the two regulations.
Hong Kong officials insist broad safeguards mean that anyone at risk of political or religious persecution or who faces torture or the death penalty will not be extradited. But critics fear it could be used to send Chinese dissidents to face trial on the mainland.
Douglas Herbert, like in 2014, this has the whole world's attention.
Yeah, the whole world, first in China, but the whole world, because people are asking that same question. Hong Kong has always been treated as a special case. It's had that so-called, under the Basic Law during the handover in 1997, a, quote, high degree of autonomy. And there was that idea of one country, two systems. And the question people are asking right now, for how much longer, right? 50 years, the clock has been ticking now for over 20 years.
It's due to end in 2047.
2047 is the absolute definitive. The Basic Law ends and China gets absolute full control. But already, and these really go to the heart of the protest, they're just the latest sort of lightning rod. We've seen similar protests. It was mentioned in this report, 2014, right? The umbrella movement. Even before that, 2003, you had 500,000 protesters taking to the streets 16 years ago, in that case against a national security law that would have punished, treason, sedition, subversion, all of that. what you have here are people saying, how much control right now is China eating away at? China's a juggernaut to a lot of these protesters, regardless of the intentions and what the Hong Kong local legislatures say. A lot of these protesters see Hong Kong as this bulldozer that is rolling over, and inevitably it is going to absolutely squash tiny Hong Kong. And along the way, while it's squashing them, squash those civil liberties, which are being steadily eroded and chipped away. So whatever they say out of Beijing, we'll respect the basic law. We have fully implemented the basic law. We have fully respected that high degree of autonomy, that special status of Hong Kong. In these protesters' eyes, and let's remember, as our reporter was saying earlier, most of them are younger, Francois, very young, some even born since after the handover. For them, they already see daily life in ways big and small changing for them.
But surely Beijing wary of not scaring away, first of all, investors, and secondly, the fact that it is this entry point for China, especially if there's a trade war, a potential trade war between the U.S. and China.
This is the fear that with this trade war, and not just the trade war, also the technology war with Huawei, and also the South China Sea, the geostrategics skirmishing over those areas right now. The U.S. and China, that Hong Kong somehow ends up as a bargaining chip. There was a special law passed between the U.S. and Hong Kong when back in 1992, before the handover, it was still a British under British dominion, and it basically exempted Hong Kong from a lot of those trade and tech limits that were imposed on the rest of China. It treated it as sort of a special territory when it comes to trade and commerce. And that's right now what is sparking a lot of fears, because we just had Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House in the U.S., basically say that if this extradition law on its third reading were to pass, that would, Congress, as she puts it, would really have but no choice but to reassess whether or not Hong Kong still enjoys sufficient autonomy, as she put it, in order to treat it as a special case. That is, to keep that special status. The capital, you mentioned this. Economically, Hong Kong is not as significant as it once was relative to the rest of China. Back in 1997, the handover was 20% of China's economy or GDP. Today, 22 years later, it is 3%. One of the cities that used to be a little backwater, a little village on the outskirts of Hong Kong, Shenzhen, has now surpassed it in the past few months in terms of total economy. So it's actually, in economic terms, much smaller and less significant than it used to be. But as you said, it's still symbolically very significant. It is still the Asian sort of economic hub and capital, even if more investors are looking now to the mainland for more opportunities. And that's what everyone's looking at and questioning right now, and how the U.S. dynamics are going to affect that play and that perception of Hong Kong as still a safe haven and a refuge within Asia, but more specifically within China for investment.
Well, with Jason Eng of the Progressive Lawyers Group from Hong Kong. Jason, does Beijing still need one country, two systems?
It's a really tough question to answer. On the one hand, as Doug mentioned earlier, the importance of Hong Kong to China has significantly diminished compared to back in 1997. And so from an economic point of view, China doesn't need Hong Kong as much as it used to. But symbolically, Hong Kong is still being held out as sort of a success story in Asia. And China certainly doesn't want the world to think that, well, Hong Kong has been so successful and prosperous under British rule, and the moment it was handed back to China, it sort of implode. And it really doesn't want that narrative to appear on the world stage. At the same time, China is also have one eye, looking at Taiwan, hoping to use Hong Kong as a success story to convince Taiwanese people that, hey, listen, one country, two system works quite well in Hong Kong. We can do the same for you. So why don't you rejoin the motherland? And if Hong Kong turns out to be a failure in terms of the one country, two systems experiment, then that would give the Taiwanese people a lot of pause in terms of whether they want to go down that path either.
And when you hear the chief executive of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, say, "How can I betray Hong Kong?" what's your reaction?
Well, I think her action itself speaks louder than any excuses or any words. And I particularly took issues with the way she compared her job being the chief executive of Hong Kong as being the people's mother. And I think that really highlights how patronizing and how much of a parent state that she's trying to run. Basically, what she's telling the people of Hong Kong is that I know best because I'm the parent. This extradition bill is good for you. So, suck it up, whether you like it or not. And that's exactly what is wrong with this government.
Jason, Doug here. Just quickly, I'm curious, how much pressure is Carrie Lam under from Beijing and the authorities? And I guess you could even extend that question. How much pressure is the Hong Kong local legislature under from the masters in Beijing?
Right. That's a really key question. That's a really good question. Nobody knows whether the extradition bill was the brainchild of Carrie Lam herself in order for her to impress Beijing. Hey, listen, I'm doing this wonderful initiative to further the integration of Hong Kong with the mainland. So I deserve some brownie points. Or is she pushing this bill because she's getting a lot of pressure from Beijing, perhaps as a result of the anti-graft movement in China, that they wanted to target a lot of the mainland people hiding mainland money in Hong Kong. And so those people can be extradited to the mainland as well as their wealth. Nobody knows that, which is which. At this point, it's almost irrelevant because the city is so angry about the bill that it doesn't matter whose idea it was. The only objective that people wanted to achieve, the protesters wanted to achieve, is for the government to withdraw the bill.
Jason Ang, the author of Umbrellas in Bloom, many thanks for joining us at what is a late hour in Hong Kong. I want to thank as well France 24's Douglas Herbert.